Maybe Israelis don't always sound optimistic, but in reality they do normally have a sunny disposition, at least in how they regard the future, how they regard the national purpose. Oh, indeed, there have definitely been troubled times, a very troubled national mood beforehand, like in the mid-60s when stagnation in terms of economic growth cast doubt on whether there was any kind of bright economic future to contemplate, or in the mid-70s following the surprise of the Yom Kippur War, which caught Israel's political and military leaders alike resting on their laurels that they never had to fear Arab armies, and again during the early days of the Second Palestinian Intifada, when the years of occupation finally seemed to have caught up and the country appeared to have lost its moral compass. And yet I don't think Israelis have ever been quite as pessimistic as they are now. Adam Cohen wrote recently in the New York Times with regard to his country, America, but it's equally applicable, I feel, to Israel of late 2006, that pessimism is the most un-American of philosophies. Our nation, he says, was built on the values of reason and progress, not to mention pursuit of happiness, whereas, Cohen goes on, pessimism as a philosophy is skeptical of the ideal of progress. Part of President Bush's legacy, declares Cohen, may well be that he has robbed America of its optimism, a force used to rally the country, as Roosevelt and Reagan did when it was deeply challenged. And he goes on to note how Bill Clinton was often mocked for his declaration that he still believed, as he put it, in a place called hope. But that Clinton understood only too well that instilling hope is a critical part of leadership. Do Israeli leaders today understand that today? I'm reminded of a very gloomy story, but a very telling story about the most famous of European performers, Grok the clown. A man was beset by terrible depression. Pessimism about the future would simply not lift its gloomy mantle off him, no matter what treatment he was prescribed, no matter how many eminent psychiatrists or spiritual leaders he consulted. Eventually he got an appointment with the world's most esteemed doctor. Even he, however, at the end of their session, felt helpless at the depth of the man's depression. The only remedy I can see is for you to go and see Grok the clown. Maybe he can help you, he tells the depressed man. Slowly, sadly, comes back the response. I am Grok. Looking in on Israelis today, as Israelis look in on themselves, it strikes me that the prevailing pessimism stems from two sources which are, in fact, part of the very same phenomenon, that absence of a leadership of hope, to which the Times columnist was referring, is the central issue. Stepping back a moment beyond this national pessimism, what never fails to strike me, wherever one goes around the country, whichever part of Israel one engages, is how buoyant a society Israel remains, how challenging of themselves Israelis are, how remarkable are achievements on the individual and collective level, and how varied and dramatic in so many arenas are those endeavors. We need only to look back to the outpouring of caring for the other, which was so spirited during the recent war with Hezbollah, when the government itself moved so slowly in caring for the daily needs of the million and more Israelis in the north of the country who were under constant bombardment. But not only in times of such peril, on an everyday basis, in so many small and large ways, it is this dissonance which is hard to understand, between those sunny achievements of Israelis, collectively and individually, the dissonance between those exploits, literally on a daily basis, and the lack of direction, the lack of agenda, the lack of inspiration about national purpose that emanates from the very top. And this from a government led by Ehud Olmert, who not only had a major agenda on the table when he went into elections last March and duly won them handsomely by getting Israelis to rally to his call that what the nation needs is finally, after so many decades, to decide for itself where its future lies, the future of its borders, physical and moral, and to pursue that purpose. Olmert promised indeed that if Israel took its destiny into its own hands, went for that purpose, irrespective of what others thought, it would ensure a truly wonderful future, make Israel a place, in his phrase, in which it would also be fun to live. That notion has gone. Israel has abandoned the agenda. Olmert has abandoned the agenda which brought him to power, that it is for Israel to fix its own desired borders and to determine its own future directions. And he provides No new viable agenda, other than a reactive one to the challenges and threats imposed upon Israel. So the gloominess about the future seems wrapped up in the strategic regional situation, which Olmert promised would change dramatically in Israel's favor if only Israel were to decide for itself its future orientation, and would not simply continue to react to outside challenges and initiatives of the outside world, specifically those of its neighbors. Now, it is true that over the last few days, Israelis have been seeing on their TVs and reading in their papers about how some of those neighbors marked what they designate as Jerusalem Day with blood-curdling threats and downright nasty predictions about how they intend to bring Israel asunder, to bring about its very demise. And even closer to hand, there is, of course, Hamas, the elected Palestinian government, absolutely obdurate, not only defiantly refusing to recognize Israel's right to exist, but implying that the Palestinian dream ought to be not coexistence at all, but the snuffing out of Israel as a separate entity. The threats do exist, and they should certainly not be ignored. But to listen to many Israelis, from the top down, you get the impression that these are the only voices in the region, the only voices among Israel's neighbors, whereas perhaps the most remarkable outcome of the difficult war against Hezbollah is not so much how it spawned afresh such nasty attitudes, but also how hopes for peace have been rekindled, how many moderates within the Arab world, Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and yes, also among the Palestinians, all insist that the time is now ripe for a real peace endeavor. There's even Syria sitting on the fence with Bashar al-Assad calling simultaneously for peace and for preparations for war against Israel, waiting, it would seem, to be tilted one way or another. Which way will Israel seek to tilt him? Tilt the whole Arab world, you could say, if it tries to extricate itself from the throes of this pessimism, seek to grab itself the initiative by propelling Israel and perhaps the region as a whole towards sunnier pastures. That too is the challenge of leadership. To repeat one of Israel's best friends of recent years, Bill Clinton, to recognize the need to believe in a place called hope.